Good morning. Well, we finished off yesterday with Moses being picked up by Pharaoh's daughter and taken into the palace. Now, you might think this is a strange thing to happen, but in fact, it was common practice. The rulers of those days would take into their palace and train alongside their own children different members of other races, in order that in due time they might be able to use them, because they would understand the way the palace worked. They would understand the policies that the government was going through. They could be sent back to their own people to instruct them and to help the rulers in the control of the people that they were dealing with. For instance, Herod, the king of Judea in the time of Jesus, had been trained in this same way in the palace of Caesar in Rome. He'd been brought up in that particular place. He understood the way that government worked. He had been trained and then sent back to Judea to be king, because the Roman authorities knew that he would understand exactly what they were getting at and what they wanted to do in the land of Judah at that particular time. And so Moses was taken in. And if we look into the Acts of the Apostles, where we come to the speech of Stephen before the elders of Israel, when he'd been arrested and before he was martyred, he tells us there quite simply that Moses was trained in all the ways of the Egyptians. He was there in that palace for about 40 years. The Pharaoh had not used him in any other way. He was amongst the princes of Egypt. And then suddenly he becomes aware, almost as if God is waking him up to the fact that he is in fact not Egyptian, but he is in fact a member of this slave race. And going out to look at them, to see what is happening with them, he finds that they are being greatly oppressed by the Egyptian overlords. And when he's out there, he sees one of the Egyptian taskmasters abusing one of these Hebrew slaves, and he suddenly becomes very angry about it. And he kills the man and hides his body in the sand. But of course, although he was living in the palace, and although he'd been brought up amongst Pharaoh's other children, to actually kill an Egyptian, well, that was one step too far. And when he realizes that this has become known, he leaves the palace in a hurry and he goes into Midian, where he meets up with his future wife Zipporah, and there lives in the wilderness for about 40 years again. 40 years, he's now about 80 years of age when God suddenly speaks to him and calls him and tells him he's now going to send him back into Egypt. This man, trained in the ways of the Egyptians, having had 40 years in the wilderness, thinking and praying about who he was and what God wanted of him, is now going to be sent back into the land of Egypt to release the tribes which have been held there and the tribes which were now being enslaved in that particular country. We all know the story. And later on, when we come to the book of Exodus, we'll be looking at it in greater detail. But he goes back to Pharaoh, and after the exhibition of many great signs, he's able to lead the people of Israel, the tribes of Israel, back out of slavery and into the desert. Satan had wanted to stop this to such an extent, but he had failed. God's plan was once again being fulfilled. So he leads them out into the desert, and as you all know, they finally came to the great Red Sea. Pharaoh's army was behind them, and Moses exercises the power of God, stretches out his rod over the sea, and God parts the waters and allows the people to go through on dry land into Arabia to Mount Sinai, where God had told him he would one day come again with all these tribes, with all these peoples. And here in this place, God was going to give him instructions about what the future was going to hold. At that time, Moses went up on the mountain and there met with God, we are told, face to face, as God explained to him exactly what he was to do. Now, as I've said before, the people said he was up on the mountain for about 40 days. But as you look at it and you realize what information he brings back with him, God must have crammed an enormous amount of information into those 40 days. Either that, or we have a difficulty with time here, that the time he has spent with God was in fact longer. It's the people down waiting for him who had seen it as 40 days. But finally, he comes back down. He comes back down with 2 tablets of stone. And here we have an interesting point, because Moses declared that God himself had written on these tablets of stone. He hadn't carved them. God himself had written on these tablets of stone. We all know what happens. He gets back down. He finds that the people have gone astray. They're having pagan parties. And he gets so angry, he literally smashes these tables of stone. But later on, God instructs him again. And this time, he has to carve the tables of stone and take them up on the mountain. But once again, it is God who writes on these tables. God himself. According to Moses, he did not write the 10 Commandments. God wrote the 10 Commandments. And we're going to come back to this again tomorrow.